So while it's not a new topic, sovereignty, digital sovereignty, cloud sovereignty seems to be on everybody's lips right now. And we wanted to cut through the noise and talk to one of the industry's foremost experts on the topic, Dave Michels. Dave, delighted to have you with me today.
Thanks, Anne.
So we're going to be looking at various dimensions of sovereignty, and we're going to be looking at ways of approaching the topic and helping clients think about where does sovereignty fit into their technology strategies and how can they adapt to things that are happening in the external environment, both technologically but also from a regulatory perspective. Dave, could you tell us a little bit more about how this topic shows up for you in your work?
Sure. So my name is Dave Michels, and I work for the Cloud Legal Project at Queen Mary University of London. My research into sovereign cloud has been funded by Microsoft and by Broadcom. While I'm really grateful for their support, I just want to be clear that I conduct my research with full academic independence and am solely responsible for the views I express here today. We started working on this topic about 3 years ago, and it has since become such a hot topic. And it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about it here today.
Fantastic. So we're going to be looking at sort of the top 10 questions that show up and looking at, first and foremost, something that can get actually quite contentious, very emotive, which is definitions of sovereignty. How do you think about it?
I think it's a great place to start, Anne, because different people use the term sovereign cloud to mean different things. So when I talk about sovereign cloud from a customer perspective, I mean broadly any service that gives the customer a high degree of control over the cloud service that they use. And that includes control over things like where your data are stored, who can access your data, for what purposes they can be used, as well as whether you're able to move your data from one cloud environment to another, or whether you're effectively locked in to a particular provider's solution. So that's sovereignty on a broad understanding. But it's important to note that the term is also used more narrowly to focus on a specific set of concerns about cloud providers who are subject to foreign jurisdiction. Now, for European organizations, they primarily use US cloud providers who are subject to US jurisdiction. And that gives rise to two key concerns. First, the concern is over foreign government access. Can the US government compel your cloud provider to hand over your data without telling you? And the second concern is over foreign government interference. Can President Trump order your cloud provider to cut you off from the cloud as part of his foreign policy? And so when I talk to people about sovereign cloud, the three concerns that come up most are foreign government access, foreign government interference, and vendor locking.
And I think you've touched on points there that are absolutely fundamental in any consideration of sovereignty, which is independence, is autonomy, is transparency. And we're going to be getting into that in more detail. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that there is a real desire on the side of customers to have a high degree of transparency so that they're able to make their own decisions. What they want is an acknowledgement of the landscape, the unmovable things, things that can't necessarily be addressed with technology. Conflict of law, for example, is one of the things that technology can't fix. But taking those as part and parcel of the external landscape and saying, now what?
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that. I think it's absolutely, the focus should be, what are we trying to achieve and what can we do within the bounds of what's possible?
Absolutely, keeping it outcome focused. So another thing that comes up in a lot of the conversations that I have with customers is related to data residency. Now, some people conflate that with sovereignty. How do you think about it?
So I think it's really crucial to differentiate data residency from the notion of sovereign cloud, because data residency does not in and of itself make a cloud service sovereign, right? Data residency is all about the physical location of your data. Where are the underlying servers located? But if we think about those three key sovereign concerns I just mentioned, data location doesn't determine the answer to those questions. right? We can start with foreign government access. Storing your data in Europe does not prevent US government access to those data, because under US law, the US government can order a cloud provider to hand over customer data regardless of where those data are stored. So even if your data are stored in Europe, if you're using a cloud provider subject to US jurisdiction, there is a risk of US government access. And the same applies to the concerns over US government interference, right? If President Trump orders your cloud provider to cut you off from the cloud, it doesn't particularly help you that the data centers where your data are stored are in Europe, right? Because the cloud provider is going to cut you off from access to those data. And lastly, from a vendor lock-in perspective, it doesn't make your data any easier to move because they're stored locally in Europe, right? So in that sense, I think it's important to differentiate between data residency, which is all about the physical location of your data, and sovereign cloud, which is much more about questions of access and control at the logical layer.
So it can make sense, for example, to have a criteria around data residency if, for example, there's a technical motivation. You might need low latency, for example. But what I'm hearing from you is that residency per se is not a guarantee of sovereignty. From what I'm understanding, it's often misconstrued that way. There might be an element of psychological safety, saying my data is close, therefore I am sovereign. But what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that's not necessarily the case. Actually, it's not even not necessarily, that's just not the case.
I think that's a great point. There can be performance benefits. There might also be regulatory requirements for data localization, but it does not in and of itself make your service sovereign.
So again, the point is being very specific about data localization for a purpose and being explicit about what that purpose is.
Yes, and being clear about what data residency will achieve and what it will not do for you.
Fantastic, thank you for that clarity. Across the European Union, we're seeing a huge push around sovereignty. It seems to be a topic on everybody's lips. In the research that you're doing and the conversations that you're having, what are you seeing as being the main drivers?
So I would say that the drivers differ per customer, depending on the sector in which they operate and the kinds of workloads and the types of data that they're looking to process in the cloud. So really broadly put, we might say that the more sensitive the data or the more critical the workload, the more you'll want to protect that from foreign governments. And so I would also differentiate between internal drivers and external drivers. Right? There are some organizations that face really strong internal drivers. They have their own operational needs to protect their data from foreign governments. And so we might think about European organizations in the intelligence agencies sector or in the defense sector. But it would also apply, say, to European startups or European universities who are conducting cutting-edge research in areas like artificial intelligence or quantum computing, right? Those are strategic areas, and those organizations might also want to protect their early-stage research findings or their trade secrets in the cloud. So those are internal drivers. And then there are also external drivers, right? Outside factors that drive organizations towards using sovereign cloud solutions. And the primary external factor that we've identified in our research is the need to comply with European regulations. And the most commonly cited regulation is the GDPR and the need to protect the confidentiality of personal data from unauthorized access by foreign governments. And so I would say that the sovereign needs differ per organization and also differ in terms of what is driving those needs.
Thank you for that clarification. I think it's really fundamental to the understanding in this. So it's not necessarily because you operate in a sensitive sector like defense that everything that you do requires a high degree of sovereignty. If I understand you correctly, it's looking at the characteristics of the data, their mission criticality, and having a risk-based approach depending on what that workload is. One of the things that shows up in my work is around a tension that can emerge between the protection of data, which is often linked to the confidentiality of it, and then the availability of data, which is absolutely essential in terms of resilience. I do a lot of work in financial services, and there is a framework called the Digital Operational Resilience Act that's applicable since early 2025. And what it requires is that firms are able to anticipate, respond, and recover to disruptions that are inevitable. And what comes up is a tension between where do we place confidentiality in relation to resilience? Because I've never heard anybody say that protecting data is a bad idea. Similarly, I've never heard anybody say that more resilience is a terrible idea. On the contrary, but it's reconciling them. And this is where very intentional design and having solid architecture and an operating model that will allow you to deliver on both of those dimensions is really essential. Could we talk a little bit about hybrid and multi-cloud? Is that something that's been talked about in your research and the organizations that you interact with?
So absolutely. As I said, I think an organization's sovereign needs differ depending on the data and the workload, right? And as you've highlighted, in some cases, confidentiality might be the most important factor. In other cases, availability might be the primary concern, right? And so step one for an organization is to assess the sovereign needs for a particular workload, right? And the next step is figuring out which IT environment will best help the organization meet those needs. And it may very well be for any given organization that there are some data that they want to keep on premises in-house, right? And there are other data where they say, look, that's fine to store and process in a US hyperscaler environment. And other data still where they are more comfortable using a European cloud provider. So that kind of setup naturally lends itself to multi-cloud and hybrid cloud deployments. Now, what we need for that to work is for there to be some level of interoperability between those different environments, right? Because otherwise, this is not going to work if those do not play nicely together. The objection that I often hear to that is that is a really complex setup, right? And that complexity can be the enemy of security. And that's not wrong, but the reality is for a lot of organizations that they are already facing that complexity. Right? A lot of organizations will not have moved all of their data out of their in-house IT. They will have moved some data to the cloud and at the same time be maintaining some on-premises infrastructure, right? So that complexity is already a reality for a lot of organizations. And the question then becomes, how can we help those organizations manage that complexity in a risk-aware manner?
And I think that's a cornerstone of the approach that we're taking in IBM, is bringing clients through a journey of thinking about their sovereignty needs, immediate, midterm, long-term, and not cutting off future optionality for short-term convenience. It can be tempting, and you're absolutely right. There can be pressure to actually move very fast and take what look like viable options, and it's not that they're wrong. I mean, they can be absolutely solid solutions, but they need to be done in a risk-aware way, and they need to be done with an acknowledgement of, are we willing to take that risk in inverted commas now because it's necessary and we'll deal with the consequences later. The thing about complexity is that it is there, whether or not we acknowledge it. The organizations that succeed best in this space are the ones that don't try to downplay the presence of complexity. They acknowledge it, work through it, don't waste time and energy on things that they can't change, but look at what's movable in their environment and navigate around it. And there are lots of ways of doing this. So I think the word of encouragement that I would like to share with people is feel empowered. It can feel difficult, and I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not because it's difficult that it's impossible.
I think that's a really nice way to look at it.
In the regulatory environment, there are multiple frameworks that are emerging, different requirements that are being published by the authorities. We've spoken about GDPR, resilience. Resilience really is everywhere. How do you see the interlock or the interplay between requirements touching sovereignty and others that would be more related to operational resilience?
So in the last year, we've seen a lot of major outages at big cloud providers, right? But I would say that those outages, when they are caused by technical issues, such as software misconfigurations, are separate from the question of sovereign cloud, right? When the outage is, as I said, due to a technical issue and not due to foreign government interference, then I would not think of that as a sovereign issue, because the need to ensure business continuity is relevant across all of your IT environments, right? Whether you're using a US cloud provider or a European cloud provider or your own in-house infrastructure, you're going to want to minimize the risk of disruptive incidents. At the same time, these incidents are inevitable, right? These are complex systems and nobody is perfect. And so the question then becomes, what are the measures we can put in place now to minimize the impact of those incidents when they do happen? And those will be measures around redundancy and recoverability. But while that question of resilience is hugely important, in my mind, it is separate from the question of sovereign cloud. And I would say that there's also a risk of interpreting sovereign cloud so broadly that it effectively becomes shorthand for a cloud service that has the features that we want, right? And if that's what sovereign cloud means, then it's such a broad definition, I think it becomes unhelpful, actually, as an analytical tool, right? As a tool for thinking about the ways in which organizations can use the cloud. If it means something so broad, then it doesn't really mean anything at all anymore. And that's why I think it's important to stick to a core definition of sovereign cloud as being about customer control.
And I think that's a really important point, because it's something that we are seeing, which is organizations wanting to acquire a sovereign cloud by whatever definition, and it procuring them a sense of psychological safety. I have a sovereign cloud, therefore I am. So you are what? Are you more secure? Are you better able to have business success? Are you better able to assure your mission? It's not immediately obvious what it is that that particular capability is delivering, which is where the methodology that we're applying to this when we're talking to clients is bringing it back to the enterprise, the mission, the workload. What is it that it requires? And going through an exercise of scenarios and planning and saying, well, what is it that you're worried about? Is it extraterritorial access to information? In that case, let's translate that into an architectural requirement, mapped to safeguards, translating that into an architecture so that we can deliver ongoing capabilities with monitoring, assurance, etc. But getting very explicit, very specific. And we could have a variety of scenarios. Some of them are sovereign, some of them are resilience. Getting clear about the difference. And fundamentally what it means is that we get down to the level of architectural requirement and blending them, so that sovereign cloud isn't a thing that you pull off the shelf. It's a designed, architected governance model, a framework for operating and a framework for delivering that ongoing assurance of not just prevention of non-authorized extraterritorial access to data, but also around the mission, making sure that the mission is assured, resilient, responsive, and adaptive to change. So thank you for bringing the clarity to that often contentious debate. One of the main developments that I think people are paying attention to is the recent publication of a major tender from one of the directorates in the EU Commission. Could you tell us a bit about how you've been reading that?
I'm glad you brought this up. What I'll say about the European Commission framework, right, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think it has some elements that are really helpful, some elements that I think are unhelpful, and some bits that I think are just uncertain. So what do I think is helpful? I think it's helpful that, as I read it, the framework is focused on risk management, right? It doesn't require you to store all your data in Europe. It doesn't require you to use a European provider per se. It requires you to address the risks we've been discussing. Risks of foreign government access, foreign government interference, and vendor lock-in. And I think it covers those 3 points relatively well. What I think is less helpful is trying to put a single score on the sovereign nature of a service, right? Because as we've said, risk management needs to be attuned to the specific scenario you're dealing with. Depends on the criticality of the workload and the sensitivity of the data. For some data sets, they might be so sensitive that confidentiality is most important. In other cases, if you're dealing with critical infrastructure, it may be that ensuring availability is the most important, right? And so trying to put a single score across those different elements of sovereign cloud, I think, is overly simplistic. I would also question whether environmental sustainability should be part of a sovereign cloud framework. Kind of like technical resilience, I think it's a hugely important issue, but I don't think it goes to the sovereign nature of the service. Lastly, what I think is uncertain is how this framework is really going to apply in practice, right? Because what we're seeing in the market is all sorts of different models of sovereign cloud. Hyperscaler sovereign cloud, partnerships between US and European providers, and then these fully sovereign Eurostack solutions. And so what will be really interesting to see is how the framework is intended to apply to those different models in practice.
That's really interesting. And I think what we've been observing, be it in policy level discussions or at the level of private sector organizations, is a bit of a, like you say, a mixed bag in terms of what organizations are looking for. This is pushing the boundary in terms of bringing clarity to some of those discussions, making it more outcome focused, because that causal link between requirements and what it actually delivers as an outcome, it can be implicit, but it's not necessarily explicit, and it's not necessarily demonstrated. What's going to be really interesting to see is the framework as an instrument of macro level economic industrial policy, and the framework as an instrument to drive enterprise level outcomes. And I'm encouraged actually that while you say, and I agree, there is a level of uncertainty embedded in the framework, it is prompting a different level of discussion, and it is prompting organizations to say, well, what is it that matters most to us? What is it that we're looking for? What do we need? And I think that is hugely beneficial because it is driving clarity. And well, it remains to be, we'll be watching this space really, really carefully as the months progress. Focusing on outcomes and mission assurance, when we're looking at technical capabilities in the context of sovereignty, encryption comes up a lot, key management comes up a lot. What's the relevance from your perspective?
So I think the relevance of encryption is that it can help customers control who can access the data they store in the cloud in the clear. And it can also help protect against that risk of foreign government access. The idea being that if your cloud provider cannot access your data in the clear, then they cannot hand over that data to a foreign government in the clear either. And so the key point there is whether your cloud provider can access the data in the clear. And that's where the question of key management comes into play, right? Who can decrypt the data? And it is possible using technologies like customer managed keys to encrypt the data in such a way that the cloud provider cannot access their contents. And I think that works really well for data at rest in the cloud. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated is when we have data in use, right? Where we need to do active processing on customer data in the cloud environment. For instance, because the cloud provider needs to re-index or restructure that data, or because the cloud customer wants to search through their data or make edits to it in the cloud. In that case, we might look to a technology like confidential computing that can enable that kind of active processing on cloud provider infrastructure without the cloud provider being able to access those data in the clear, right? So from my perspective, I would say that a combination of customer-managed keys with confidential computing can provide a really high level of protection for the confidentiality of customer data and so help customers meet their sovereign needs.
And those would be foundational building blocks, I think, in terms of the capabilities that IBM brings to customers when we're looking at these topics. Like we mentioned earlier in the discussion, there are certain things that technology cannot address. And what we are bringing to that conversation is an acknowledgement of what is within our locus of control, what we can bring to clients in terms of exercising their agency and what they actually can manage. There is a complexity in the legal and regulatory environment that none of us can fix by ourselves, but what is the best we can do with what we've got where we are? And confidential computing and keep your own key are pivotal in actually making sure that clients remain, insofar as possible, in the driver's seat and in the exercise of their agency over their data and their infrastructure. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. They're, like I say, they're critical enabling capabilities. Let's circle back on the topic of portability and interoperability, open standards. What we're seeing in a lot of conversations that we have is that there is a desire to move fast, which is very understandable. We always encourage our customers, though, to think forward and to be very intentional about their design. For us, sovereignty hinges on solid architecture, where we're thinking about what is needed by the enterprise right now, what might happen. We can't know upfront everything that might happen, but we can think forward and design for optimized optionality. And that's where portability, interoperability, open standards really come into their own. Is that something that's borne out by your research?
Yeah, I would say that both interoperability and portability are very much relevant to the discussion around sovereign cloud. Right? And we've already mentioned interoperability in the context of enabling multi and hybrid cloud deployments. But I also think data portability is absolutely key to sovereign cloud deployments. Right? If you are going to be able to exercise a high degree of control over your data, you need to be able to move them from one IT environment to another, or potentially move them back in-house, depending on your needs at any given time. And I do think there is a role here for regulations, as we see under the EU Data Act, and as we may well see in the UK following the CMA's investigation. But I also think that there is a role here for customers. Right? There are things that customers can do to design and deploy their workloads in a way now that makes portability more realistic later. Right? And that will be things like you've mentioned: open standards, open data formats, open source software, as well as applying technologies like containerization that can make data portability easier in the future. Right? And so I put that as a bit of a challenge to customers as well. Are you designing your workloads for portability, for control, or are you designing them to move fast and for convenience? Right? Because there is a trade-off there between control and convenience. Right? The more you use a particular provider's proprietary or managed services, the more you are effectively locking yourself into that provider's solutions. Now, those are very convenient solutions, right? And I get it. We're all very, very busy, and so there is a certain appeal to convenient solutions. But it is up to customers to ask themselves, well, wait a minute, are we maximizing for control, or are we maximizing for convenience? And I think a lot of customers will say they want a high degree of control, but then end up choosing the most convenient options. And that's why I would put it back on providers as well and say, hey, how do you as cloud service providers offer customers services that give them the high degree of control that they want, but also support the convenience that they so clearly desire?
Absolutely, and I love that, which is, a little bit of pushback is healthy. One of the sanity checking questions that I like running by my clients is saying, if somebody came and asked you to justify your choice, could be a regulator. I work a lot in financial services, for example. Imagine a banking supervisor came and said, tell us a little bit about how you're moving to the cloud and why have you chosen such and such a provider and what's allowing you to stay in control and how are you managing your risk and what would happen if you needed to exit, etc., etc. I often find that those kind of prompts give them pause because they don't necessarily have the answers. And that in itself is not a problem, but it's moving beyond the, not quite sure about that, to here's how we'll tell that story. And that's absolutely essential, not just in financial services, but across the board, all enterprises, but all the more so when you're in sectors that are sensitive, that are classified as critical national infrastructure. Being able to tell the narrative in a way that stacks up. There are reasons when cost and convenience, might be given primacy. There are reasons and situations where that might make sense. But I think your point is that it has to be intentional. And in the environment that we're in right now, having the possibility to adjust, adapt, and pivot, also essential. And I don't think any risk management strategy can call itself that without having those characteristics in it.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it really works well with cybersecurity regulations in the EU framework, because often what you're required to do is to put in place appropriate and proportionate measures, right? So that forces you, in effect, as an organization, to undertake that kind of holistic, realistic risk management exercise, which is exactly what you're suggesting.
So we've spoken about the main drivers around sovereignty and this idea of protecting data, the confidentiality of data, extraterritorial access. Some people sometimes wonder, why as IBM we are drawing attention to that. And it's not that we're drawing attention to it per se, but it's there, it's in the landscape. And we've talked about the fact that, the tension between different jurisdictional regimes. Technology providers and private sector clients don't really have a lot of control over that, if any. Nonetheless, organizations need technology to run their businesses. And what we're really interested in is being very pragmatic about this and saying to clients, let's focus on you, your business, your mission. What do you need that will allow you to be successful, driving the outcomes that are essential for your success and the trust and reputation that you've built up? And what we see in this is that there are characteristics of the operating model, the architecture, and assurance technologies. Assurance is absolutely fundamental, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think assurance has to be part of this discussion because customers need to have some level of assurance that these measures that providers have put in place to enhance and achieve these sovereign outcomes are actually working in practice, right? To make sure that their sovereign objectives are actually being met. I think it's great that we see so many cloud providers launching sovereign services, and that we've seen so many developments in that respect in this past year, people announcing various sovereignty-enhancing measures. Where I think cloud providers could do a better job is in two respects. First, I think they could be better at providing more transparency about what their measures do in practice, right? What risks does each measure address, and what does it not do, right? What are the residual risks that remain? So I think in that sense, transparency and trust go hand in hand. The second thing I think cloud providers could be better at doing is evidencing those claims, right? You say that this measure is in place and protects against this risk. Great. But don't just tell me, right? Show me. Can we get that independently audited? Is there a set of software tools that can show me that this is working in practice? And that, I think, can give customers the level of assurance that they need, but it can also give them something to show a regulator if they need to show how they're meeting certain regulatory requirements. And lastly, I think it can also be helpful for customers to show their own customers, right? If they are part of a supply chain that needs to have sovereignty needs met throughout the supply chain.
Which is fascinating in terms of just a mental model about thinking. It's, thinking about this complex topic, it's not enough just to make a claim. We need to move beyond claims into the evidencing, and it's not a point in time. It needs to be continuous. Like, these are sensitive missions, sensitive data. It needs continuous protection. So that idea of having a posture that is threat informed, it's risk managed. And I think, again, bringing this back to what is within the locus of control of providers and clients, well, on our side, we're looking at engineering. What can be engineered into the platform? What wraparound automation can be brought into the fray? What tooling can be made available to clients to actually allow that regulator ready, or not even just regulator ready. I mean, an organization, even if they're not subject to external scrutiny, needs to be able to manage their own risk and their own technology stack. So those are fundamental capabilities, and I think you're right. I think we're going to see more and more of that, which is claim, trust, verify, and it's an exciting space.
I'd agree.
No discussion of sovereignty would be complete with some mention of AI. Now, while the two don't have to go hand in hand, they might do. What way are you thinking about sovereignty in the context of AI, or conversely, AI in the context of sovereignty?
So I guess the way I think about it, right, is that we can take a lot of the discussion around sovereign cloud and apply it to the way in which we all adopt AI solutions. Because I think a lot of the same risks apply. But if we've talked about sovereign cloud in the sense of foreign government access, foreign government interference, and vendor lock-in, we can think about that same set of concerns as applying to the use of AI services. So foreign government access. Will OpenAI hand over every prompt that you put into ChatGPT to the US government under US law? That could be a concern. Foreign government interference, right? The more that European organizations come to rely on AI services as part of their business processes, the greater the risk of them being cut off from US services at the behest of the US government. And lastly, we can also have issues around vendor lock-in. The more a particular user uses a Gen AI solution, the more that solution becomes tailored to their particular needs. And similarly, at the organizational level, right, the more that an organization customizes a particular AI solution, for example, by uploading its own training data, the more they become locked into that particular solution, and the more difficult they would find it to move over to a different solution and achieve the same level of performance. So while I think we're seeing the same risks, I actually think there's an opportunity here, because we're at a much earlier stage of adoption. Right? So we don't have to adopt AI solutions the way we adopted cloud. We can think about these things from the start, right? And learn the lessons from sovereign cloud and apply them to our adoption of AI systems so that we build a high degree of customer control in from the start.
And I think that's spot on. That's absolutely verified by the anecdotal experience I have in dealing with clients on these topics, which is cloud has gone through multiple iterations in terms of how organizations have matured, how they're thinking about it. And the organizations that are doing well, in inverted commas, on AI are the ones that are actually transposing the learning that they have from cloud, the difficulties that they've experienced, some of the challenges that they've encountered along the way. And while the subject matter is different, the macro themes around risk management, around remaining in the driver's seat, around strategic autonomy, and around the business centricity, the questioning of, are we really sure about what we're doing with this technology and why? Are we willing to expose ourselves to a certain degree of vendor risk, supply chain risk, third-party risk, because the benefit outweighs the vulnerability that we might be incurring? It's just a level of maturity in terms of acknowledging what the trade-offs are and being willing to accept them because it makes sense in terms of driving forward a mission. And I think that's where we're getting to in the industry, and I think it's very encouraging, is that there's no perfection on these topics. They're complex, but they require a maturity of decision making and an acknowledgement of what cannot be changed, and just a very sensible leveraging of capabilities. We've talked about technical measures operational measures, commercial contractual measures, all of that coming together, driving forward responsible, intentional use of technology with diligent stewardship, I think is probably the best term, in the service of a mission.
I think that's really well put.